Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Poema podcast. I am James Prescott, your host. Welcome to the show. It's really great to have you all here again. I'm really glad to have you all here. And today I have a new guest on the show, a good friend of mine from Twitter, and somebody I'm really excited to talk to. Amber Kay, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, James. It's really great to be here. I've actually never done a podcast before, so this will be a really fun and interesting experience for me, I think.
Awesome. I've had actually a lot of people that I've had on the show. It's been their first podcast that they've done, and some of them have gone on to do like bigger podcasts, and some of them just came back here. Like it just depends on who it is. But oh, that's nice. Yeah, I'll try and don't worry. This is completely. You can make mistakes here. It's totally fine. It's totally informal on this podcast. So I tried to keep it informal. You're Amber Kay, and your pronouns are she, they. And we met through Twitter. And, well, I say we have a mutual friend, but they're more than a friend to you. But who was on here before, Ali.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to listen to hear your story today. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Just tell us a bit, before we get into your story, just tell us a bit about yourself.
So I am 31 years old. I have lived in the United States for most of my life. When I was much younger, my father was in the military, and so we moved around quite a bit, mostly in the southern states, so mostly like Texas and Mississippi and Alabama and that area down there. And then ultimately we moved up to Missouri to be closer to my mother's side of the family. And they're a very evangelical group, very into that sort of thing. And so I really hadn't experienced organized religion until we moved back to Missouri when I was probably 6.
Right.
And so it was a very rough transition for me because I was like, this is actually really weird and I don't like any of this. I didn't like the clothes that I had to wear. I didn't like the really long church services and everything. And that's really when I first started acting out a lot. And when I first started noticing that maybe I was different from other people, behaviorally, because, everybody else can sit through church and I'm just like, no, I couldn't do it. So there was that. Around the age of 11 or 12, I started having epileptic seizures. But we didn't know that that's what they were. A lot of the doctors around here said that it was a women's issue. They're just like, you're coming of age, and some women, pass out. That's just a thing that happens. And I was kind of like, my parents definitely didn't like that as an answer because it sounded very nondescript. It felt very minimizing to the seizures that I was having that they could see and that they could witness. Especially since sometimes they were very dangerous. Like I had a seizure while I was swimming, and a cousin of mine had to like drag me out of the lake because I was in essence drowning. So it was a very dangerous time for me while I was undiagnosed. So that was honestly one of the things that has consistently just held me back the most, because I didn't get a diagnosis. We didn't find something that worked until I was in my early 20s.
Wow.
Yeah. So it was very scary. It was scary not knowing what was wrong, or why I was having these symptoms. But it was definitely something that was pervasive and caused significant issues.
Wow. I started having seizures when I was 9 years old. I got diagnosed. Fortunately, I got diagnosed relatively quickly, and on medication relatively quickly. Although it took a long time for me to find medication that got it under control. Like, yeah, I mean, like, I was still having seizures, even though I was on medication. So I understand that it's scary. I don't think I realized how scary it was at the time. I just got on with it. I didn't really think about it as much because I was going through a childhood trauma anyway, so I had other things going on. But yeah, that is a scary thing, especially when it's not even diagnosed.
Hmm.
And that's awful. That's a long time to get a diagnosis as well. Like, yeah.
I definitely think medical care in this area is not great. Um,
Mm,
and there's also such a massive influence of like evangelical culture and just
mm,
the way that they view, you know, womanhood and femininity to the point where they they would brush things off a lot, whereas, maybe if because I had male cousins that got diagnosed with epilepsy and then ultimately were diagnosed with autism as well. And so they have a diagnosis, but for me, it was brushed off. And so I wonder to what extent that may have had an effect.
wow. I'm so sorry. I'm glad you got a diagnosis in the end, though.
Yes. We
Because,
just we had to go into a bigger city. And it was really by chance. I had a seizure and it was icy out, and so I slipped and dislocated my shoulder.
mm,
And they took me into the hospital, and I'm telling this doctor in the hospital, what happened, and he's like, because I went in for the shoulder. I'm like, my shoulder's dislocated. I'm in pain. I need something for this, and he's like, let's take a couple of steps back, and I want you to explain to me again the episode you called it before you slipped and
yeah.
fell. And so I explained it to him. And he's like, that's a seizure. And I was like, oh, well, thank you for like giving it a name. And then almost immediately he referred me to a neurologist who then
Mm,
started trying different medication for
mm,
me.
yeah. Well, I'm glad you got the diagnosis in the end.
Absolutely. It made such a significant change in my life, in my independence and mobility, um, to have
Yeah.
just even a name for what I was experiencing and having, set things I could tell people and explain my needs, whereas before it's just like, I kind of have the dropsies. That's what my grandma called it. She's like, you've got the dropsies, and sometimes you just, and so
Mm,
like you can't be like, yeah, I just like lose consciousness sometimes. Like, it's a
mm,
thing that happens where if you're like, I have epilepsy, I have seizures, a lot of times they're associated with specific stimuli. That creates a
mm,
parameter where you can manage your life.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't had a seizure for 8 years now, nearly. Which I feel very fortunate. you know, I used to have
Yeah.
them all the time. I used to have them every couple
Mm-hmm.
of months. It was, and then it just stopped for some reason. I don't know why. I can't explain it, um, yeah, it's scary. Like, I mean, I only realised at 38 that there's this thing called sudden death through epilepsy. Like, in that I could, if I had a certain kind of seizure, I could just go and like. But I found out also that after 40, it's like there's like almost 0% chance of that happening. Like, they've never had anyone. That's never happened to anyone over 40. So once you get to 40,
Mm.
you're right. Once I got to 40, I was like, yes, I can't die of epilepsy anymore. Like, it was. But it's. I mean, it's like it's not very. It doesn't happen very often anyway. But it was. Yeah, it's just. It's like when you wake. Like, I mean, what probably this is like, but when you wake up somewhere, you don't know how you got there. Like, and I think I had a seizure at a bus stop once, and the gravel was kind of uneven on the bus stop, and I hit my head right on where the uneven gravel was. Like, so I had blood all over my face, and went to hospital and stuff. Yeah, I've got some crazy stories. Once I fell on the railway tracks when the train was coming. Yeah, and I woke up in the ambulance, and I had no idea what had happened. And they told me that two people had jumped on the railway tracks and taken me off the track. I don't know how they did it. Because the train was literally coming, apparently, and it was like literally 2 or 3 minutes away. And and kind of basically saved my life, And I was 22 when that happened, and so crazy. But that's just one of many stories that I have. Some of them are quite funny in hindsight, but yeah.
Yeah, one time I had a seizure during the 4th of July, and I had like a rocket, like firecracker in my hand type thing. And so I guess when the seizure, I like shot it at one of my cousins. And in retrospect, it's funny because nothing bad happened. But yeah, I guess they're just like, you're just going to kill me, passing out. You're shooting fireworks at me. But yeah,
I know. It's so, there's some funny stories.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's good to actually share that with somebody else who's epileptic, because I've never actually had a chance to do that before. But then kind of this like you talk about a diagnosis of autism as well, like because I'm on the spectrum, although I'm not officially diagnosed, but I'm kind of self-diagnosed. I'm working on getting a formal diagnosis at the moment, and I think you're on the spectrum as well. Is that right?
Yes, and I've never been formally diagnosed either. But just as I was growing up around other people who were being diagnosed, I remember my earliest realization is when I have a cousin who's about 10 years younger than me. And I was a pretty significant caretaker for him. I was around him very regularly. And I thought, I'm like, this is a perfectly, this is what babies in our family act like. It's not a big, I didn't see anything off or unusual because I'm like, this is perfectly normal behavior that this child is exhibiting. And then he got sent to preschool, and almost immediately they started like doing assessments and eventually diagnosed him with autism. And I'm like, no, like he's not autistic. He can't have autism because that would mean that. And then I was like, oh, okay, all right, that's clicking. Like, because I was probably like 16 or 17 by this point, and I was just like, oh well, that actually explains a lot then. Okay, and so he did give me kind of an excuse for why all of a sudden, like, I was just reading up on like autism symptoms and like, necessary like accommodations and what meltdowns look like. Cause they're like, oh, you're just so concerned about your baby cousin. And I'm like, no, bitch, like, this is about me. I'm like, I'm also concerned for the child, but like, I'm like, having like a realization here of essentially something that explains my entire life to me, so but no.
I mean, there is kind of a tie between epilepsy and being on the spectrum as well. Like it's there is some people both have both. It's not always the same, but I've noticed that a lot of epileptic people that I know also on the spectrum. So like how did like kind of that realization impact your kind of personal journey and kind of discovering who you were?
I definitely think that it helped a lot, because at that point in time, I was having significant difficulty with school. I had been homeschooled up to that point, and even though I was in a fairly controlled environment, like when I was doing my schoolwork, anytime we went out, I would be so incredibly overwhelmed. And I just wouldn't, I would watch the rest of my family interact with other people. And I always kind of felt like I was a mimic, or like I was somebody who really didn't fit in. Like I was repeating things that they would say, but I didn't really like fully understand like why I was saying those things, or sometimes even like what the process was for different social interactions. So like if I was completely alone, I'm just like staring at people, like having like an internal like panic attack sort of thing of just like, oh my God, I don't know how to have conversations that aren't
Mm.
prompted by someone else, or aren't like either scripted, or like there's a facilitator of some kind. You know what I mean? Of a third person who's able to help kind of guide that conversation for me. And so it honestly it explains so much, and it allowed me to give myself a little bit more grace, like not always feel like I'm just deficient in some way, I'm struggling, and, it's something that's wrong with me. It's just that I have a different neurological makeup than some of the other people that are around me.
Yeah, yeah, well, and that's it. And I that resonates a lot. Before I realised I was on the spectrum, I always wondered why I struggled in social situations and why everyone else just knew how to behave, or what people were actually communicating when they said certain things, like, or like the rules of social interaction, like and I kind of, now looking back, I kind of basically had to teach them to myself. I had to learn, like literally learn how to do it. Like, so, like when I used to be in the church and stuff, and there were people in like little groups talking. I would literally be studying the conversation, studying people's reactions to gauge how I should react, or whether I should say something, or what I should say, or how I should say it. I realized I literally taught myself how to do this, and it was like it takes energy to do that as well, which is why those situations were always so draining, because I was not just because
Mm-hmm.
I'm an introvert, which doesn't help in terms of energy around social spaces, but I was actually having to use energy to figure out what was going on all the time, and just pretend, and of course masking, like pretending that I was, oh yeah, I'm completely here, I'm fully present, I know what's going on, I'm no different to any of you, like, because it takes a lot of energy to do that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
you kind of, people don't realize, and of course if you don't even know you're autistic yourself, which I didn't at the time, it's even worse. Like you think, you feel bad about it, like you feel there's something wrong with you. Well, actually, it's just how your brain works.
Absolutely. And I sometimes I will explain it to people as like I just if my brain was a computer, there's just an app working in the background that nobody else has, and it's actually like tanking my battery on my computer. And it's like that's the app that is, routing all my social interactions for me, figuring out what's appropriate, what, different thing I should sequence next in the pattern. And I'm like, but if that app goes down, the entire system goes down, and that's when I have like a meltdown, or I have burnout, is when, like, if I don't have that app running, then I'm kaput. So
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good metaphor. I like that. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Like, yeah, our brains require a different app to run. Like, successfully,
Mm-hmm.
or we have meltdowns. Yeah, absolutely. And meltdowns are real. Not nice, but yeah, that makes so much sense, isn't it? I mean, it's an excellent
Yeah.
metaphor. Like, I think I'll use that with my nephew because he's on the spectrum too. One day we can
Yeah.
use that to explain it to him. Uh, yeah, that's a really good metaphor. I like that.
Yeah. When I thought of it, it was because I had a computer that was going so slow. And, I was like, I'm going to have to probably get rid of this computer. And I ended up you can run an analysis of what apps are taking up like the most energy and like delete them and everything. And then I did that and I cleaned up everything that was like running in the background, and then it started working perfectly. And I was like, for neurotypicals, they don't need all those extra apps. They're like this computer where if you have too many, it clogs everything up. But for us, there's at least one that it's required, but it's taking up the same amount of energy that all of those like unnecessary apps would for like a neurotypical person, you know, of maybe just like having difficulty at work, or, having like a death in the family. Like for us, we're kind of on that same level of like social difficulty all the time. I feel like, it always feels like there's something extra going on, where we're just at that precipice of like, if one more thing goes wrong, it can kind of push me over. So,
Yeah, and
but
I guess you've learned, like all of us have to, is to figure out how to get through those moments and how to manage our responses and
mm-hmm.
all of that kind of thing. So that, like, I mean, one of the things that I do, like, and I don't know, is that I those days where everything goes wrong and everything's just everything bad that can happen does happen, and you can have a meltdown easily, and you can get triggered easily, whatever. Like, and it's just one thing goes wrong, and another thing goes wrong, and it's like just. So I set this rule in my brain of like one of those days. So if I start having a day like that, I'll just decide, okay, it's one of those days, like, and then under that banner, like anything bad can happen, and it's like, and I won't have a meltdown. So like, so once I've realised it's those sort of things are starting to happen, I just changed my. It's almost like changing a setting, like in your brain. Like it's like changing it to one of those days, right? Okay, so now it's okay. I can deal with it, like because I'm expecting it because my brain. I'm like I've got my brain trained to accept that under certain circumstances, like a autistic rule kind of thing. Like and doing that has really helped. I've done that with. I've tried to. Every time I come up with come face to face with a conflict, I come up with a different rule, like setting. I suppose it's a setting on the app, you could call it, like to allow me to manage that situation, so I don't have to so I don't have a meltdown, and or the meltdown's not as bad. Like, do you have any kind of things that you do to help manage those responses?
I think similar to you, like I definitely have like different settings, and not just when I'm having like a bad day, but if I know I'm going to have like a really long day, like I kind of go on energy saver mode, where it's just like, I'm going to do the bare minimum. And I know that I have to, if I'm going to make it until, 8 PM, if it's going to be like a 12-hour day, like I'm going to be taking a lot of breaks. And I will even schedule those on my phone of just little reminders, like it's time to sit down. It's time to go drink water. It's time to do this. So that like I have that on my phone, or I even, at work, block it off on my calendar, and that's something. I make it private. Only I can see that, from somebody on the outside looking at my calendar. It just looks like I probably have an appointment or something. Not that this is like my water getting time, or but something I noticed with that is like neurotypical people do that automatically. they have set breaks, where I'm more inclined to just keep going. I have to keep going and I can't stop until I have achieved whatever goal I have. And so within itself, like setting breaks, things like that have to become their own goals. And I also have to usually if I know something's going to be especially draining, like setting up an out beforehand, which with that, it could be a friend. Usually whoever's my out, I tell them they're my out. I'm like, it's possible I'm going to want to leave this event. I'm going to want to do something else. And, I'm going to possibly text you, and then you're going to call me and you're going to tell me that I'm supposed to leave. And then, because for me, I feel like most people are able to let themselves out of social situations without making it awkward. And I just can't, and I've accepted that about myself. And I think that, just things like that have helped a lot, like recognizing, I guess, when I need to ask for help, or when I need to create a structure to where I'm able to recognize that I need to help myself. So.
Yeah, that's important, when we're on the spectrum, and, because it's important to be aware and what works for us and what doesn't work for us, and just accept how our brains work, and just learn to manage that. It's like having a relationship with your body, embodiment is so important, that you get to know yourself and your body and can manage it well. And yeah, I know what you mean about the feeling guilty for leaving stuff early socially. Absolutely. I struggled with that as well. It doesn't happen as often now because I don't go out as much now, but I definitely used to struggle with that a lot. That's definitely the thing. But I'd always be tired halfway through an evening and want to go home. And I thought it's just because I didn't enjoy it, but it's just because I was using up tons more energy than everybody else. And being highly sensitive as well, just absorbing more than everybody else. So yeah, it's getting to know yourself. And so you, so you've had this kind of this story where you've experienced epilepsy, and you've got epilepsy and autism. How has that kind of fed into embracing and discovering and your gender identity and your sexuality, and building a life around that as well?
So my sexuality for me was fairly obvious from the time I was young. But I actually, I still had a very binary concept of sexuality. It's you can be either straight or you can be gay. I had no concept of a gray area, or any concept of there being a middle. So really, when I was a teenager, I very much noticed I was attracted to other girls. And so I was just well, you must be gay then. And I'm and we're never going to tell anyone ever. Because by that point, I had recognized that wasn't something that was very socially accepted, within the church and within my family. But as I got older, and once I kind of started to realize I do have very black and white thinking, it's there isn't really an either or. If you're attracted to both, then that can be a thing. You know what I mean? And so I was I slowly started to diverge from, well, I'm a lesbian, to, not all the time. That still is maybe a preference for me, but that doesn't mean that it has to be a rule. I can allow myself to seek out connection, or allow different types of connections to happen, naturally, instead of saying, well, because I kind of created a rule for myself. We're only attracted to girls. That's the only thing we can be attracted to. And I would kind of dismiss any other information that might be coming in about my preferences. And so I think realizing I was autistic and starting to kind of take apart some of the rules and the ideas that I had created for myself to kind of structure my environment really did lead me to ultimately identifying as bi. Because for me, I don't know that necessarily, like, I don't think that like genitalia or even like somebody's appearance has that much to do with it. I really think it's more about their energy or like the way we connect and the way that we resonate, even if, obviously some people are just attractive, and you can notice that, but that doesn't necessarily mean I would want a romantic connection with like someone that I found attractive even, So allowing for some of that nuance, I think helped a lot in terms of just my relationships and the way I formed different relationships and everything like that. But in terms of gender, I really didn't start questioning gender at all really until I met some like trans women and started listening to their experience and realized, like womanhood's actually like an important concept to you in terms of how you see yourself. Because for me, like womanhood was always like more of a performance. It was part of, if I was going into a situation I was masking, I would make sure my hair looked a certain way. I would make sure that I was dressed in what I considered to be feminine and appropriate, but that definitely wasn't my default. Like I would use that as kind of a shield, almost to keep other people a little bit at arm's length. Like you're meeting me, but you're not really meeting like me, because the most genuine form of myself isn't this person. And I started to realize and kind of deconstruct my concept of gender after just, hearing other people's experiences with it. And I was like, I guess like I don't actually have a gender that I really align with for myself. I can see it in other people and I recognize it's important, and I can kind of try to reflect whatever I think is appropriate, but that's not the same as that being an identity, So it definitely, it was a weird journey. Like the sexuality part felt natural. It was more of just like I just need to be less rigid, in my thinking about sexuality and about relationships in general. Whereas the gender, I was just like, it almost felt like realizing, I compare it to like if somebody that you care about gives you a gift and you don't like it, but you still have to keep that gift and have it like on display somewhere just in case they come over to your house, and you can be like, look, I still have this thing you bought me. I care about you and I recognize you care about me too. And I was kind of treating gender presentation like that. I'm like, well, when I'm around people that I know expect this gender of me, then I'm going to put that on display for them so that they know like I understand like what's going on, or like what kind of social interaction we're having. But
yeah,
yeah.
it's really an interesting analysis of it, like because it really breaks down this concept of gender as a kind of a construct, like it's rather than just what genitalia you have, right? And which I've never heard it articulated that well before, and because like, I mean, you literally described it like you behaved a certain way according to the expectations of people around you, which was maybe more traditionally feminine, I guess, what you would say, like what kind of evangelicalism or whatever certain people have as an idea of being feminine, and then in other places you'd be different, and it does kind of really show that a lot of that idea of gender is a construct. It's not about what genitalia you have.
Mm-hmm.
It's identity. It's more identity than it is about what your body can do. And yeah, that's really well articulated.
Well,
um,
thank you. Yeah.
I'm glad you. Yeah, and I'm glad you found you discovered that element of yourself and embraced that. It's always really encouraging when that happens. Like yeah. And how did that make you feel actually when you started to really embrace like your identity and share that with others and be more open about it? How did that affect you?
Honestly, I think that it made me feel a lot less anxious in a lot of ways because fully accepting who I am and what my true like default setting, is allows me to conscientiously embody that more. I notice more now if I flip over into whatever, my more public facing mask, where before I didn't recognize that at all. I was just like, I thought that was an element of my personality. Like I just thought that's, part of who I was. Um, and I would always be so tired, after social interactions. And I still like, I will just sleep, 12, 14 hours a night, if I'm in very like aggressively social situations, you know, I need so much rest, and being able to kind of see myself for who I really am and start to embody that has really changed the way I interact with other people and allowed me to be more free to not use as much of my energy to try to like appease others or feel safe, and I think also just having more friends, having a group that I feel comfortable around has also really made that shift for me, because I feel comfortable enough to know that if we're in a dangerous situation, like I have people that can help me get out of it, instead of me having to kind of essentially like perform my way out of like sticky social interactions or things like that. um, and I do think being perceived as a woman, I recognized it very early on that like some interactions are unsafe. And it was always really hard for me to tell which ones were unsafe and which ones were maybe just uncomfortable. Um, but feeling more comfortable in myself and more comfortable with the people that I have around me gives me space to kind of take a step back and assess, instead of just immediately going into like, that mode where I have to protect myself. I'm going to be presenting as my most, competent, appeasing feminine, form of myself. Because definitely like if I perceive like there's any sort of like danger at all, like I almost go into like a hostess mode. I'm just like, what can I do for you? What do you need? Do you need a drink? How about you sit down? And that's not me, you know. It's like, but people who don't know me well very much think that that's my personality. I'm this helper. I'm, such a people person. And then people who know me well is just like, no, like I'm a very kind person, but if I'm comfortable with you, I'm not going to go out of my way to like make you feel like, like I still, to some extent, I still am like, I want people to feel comfortable in my home, but you're not going to feel like you're at like a bed and breakfast or something like that. It feels more natural, and just more like you're another person, within my family unit, and the way I would treat somebody I consider as, like someone who's close to me. But yeah, so yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you sharing. It's yeah, and being so vulnerable as well. So thank you.
Yeah.
What is just to feel like to finish? I guess what is it? What's one thing you've learned on your journey that you'd like everyone else to know?
I think just that, wherever you're at right now, you know, to not feel like you need to be better or be somebody than the person that you are right now, because like there's definitely been points on my journey where I really did, wish I was someone else or I was somewhere else. And I think it can be really hard when you're struggling with different types of chronic illness, or, any type of, identity issues, especially with some of the very concerning things we have going on right now in the United States with um, anti-trans bills being passed and everything like that, that it's hard to feel like you're enough, you know. It's hard to feel like you can do enough, but I think what you really have to embody is that just by, you know, being alive, being present, living your life, and being around, the people that you care about, like you are enough in and of itself, without anything else.
I love that, and I agree completely. Yeah, thank you. And
Yeah.
where can people find you on online?
So for my Twitter, I'm Owlet Amber K. And then on Instagram, let me check. But my professional Instagram is a tarot account, and it's Intuitive Tarot with Amber. So if anyone wanted to follow me and just, I usually pull tarot spreads and things like that. Um, so if anybody was interested in following me about that and maybe seeing what I'm doing over on my business account, that would be pretty cool.
Excellent. Fantastic. And I follow all those accounts, so give those a follow. Amber is wonderful, as you've probably seen today. So, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing your story. It really is inspiring and encouraging. So, thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, honestly, anytime. Well, I'm sure we could have you back sometime. That'd be great. We could
Yeah.
probably talk about tarot or anything. But thanks for coming on.
Awesome.
And thanks for listening, everyone.